Next up, we're going to take a look at the hierarchical organization of body plans. We're going to be focusing on vertebrates, so we're talking about fairly complicated body plans, whether it's a fish or a frog, a bird, or a mammal such as you and I. We talked about the fact that when you have a complex body plan like this, to make sure there is a great enough surface area to volume ratio within the cells and the organs and the organ systems, you have a lot of internal folding and wrinkles and that type of thing. Between the cells, we have what's called interstitial fluid, like I mentioned. Interstitial comes from the Latin for stand between. So to make sure that you have enough surface area to have material moving in and out of all these complex body systems, you have to have this interstitial fluid as well as all these twists and turns that we talked about. So let's start with a single cell and work our way up from there. The hierarchical organization of body plans you have studied before as a middle school student, also as a freshman biology student. We know that the smallest unit of a living thing is called a cell. Cells do everything that living creatures do. We would expect a cell to grow and change over time, respond to its environment, reproduce, take in nutrition, get rid of waste products, everything that a living creature does. So starting with a single cell, enough cells grouped together that have a common function for a common purpose form what we call a tissue. In this case, we might have a muscle cell forming together with other muscle cells to create some sort of muscle tissue, and there's a couple different kinds. And then those tissues are grouped together for a specific function or purpose in what we call an organ. So in this case, we might be talking about the heart, which is an organ of the body. That organ works with other organs, such as blood vessels, arteries, and veins, to form an organ system. Oftentimes, organ systems have one primary purpose or job, plus potentially 2 or 3 other secondary jobs or purposes. And then all of those organ systems, when put together in the right way, form the complete organism itself. Same thing with plants. You have a single cell through tissues, organs, all the way up through organ systems, and then the complete organism. Sometimes you have parts that are part of multiple organ systems, like for example the pancreas. Good example where you might say, well, the pancreas is part of the digestive system, pretty obviously, but it's also part of what we call the endocrine or the endocrine system. And so some of these parts will have multiple functions, just like some of the systems will have multiple functions as well. So starting with the cell, moving all the way up through tissues, organs, organ systems, and organisms. Here's a good overview. If you're talking about a complex creature like a human or a dog, a mammal, or basically any of the vertebrates, most of them have the same organ systems. We're going to hit on some of these in the upcoming chapters just briefly, but here's a good summary. Of course, if you've done any dissection, you've seen the internal structure of creatures, maybe a frog or a shark or a fetal pig or something like that, and you see that not everything inside there looks the same. You have different organs, different tissues, and that's because they have different jobs, and those tissues are well suited, the structure is well suited for their different function. But all of those tissues and organs are really derived from a very small set of different cell and tissue types. So organs that are quite different from each other, like lungs and blood vessels, which don't really seem to have much in common, they still have some common properties because they are aligned with the same basic tissue types. And there's really only 4 tissue types. So we're going to look at the 4 main categories of tissues, and they are epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. In your textbook on page 856 through 858, you can find a great overview and set of illustrations that kind of shows these 4 main categories of tissue using a wolf as an example. So great illustrations. We'll look at some of them here as well. So let's start with the outer coverings called epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue covers the outside of your body, so your skin is obviously epithelial tissue. It also lines the organs and cavities within the body, and it contains cells that are closely joined together. There's a couple different shapes of the cells in epithelial tissue, but they're very similar as far as their structure and makeup in the way that they are put together. The shape of the epithelial cells can be kind of square, cube. We call that cuboidal, which is kind of a cool word to say, cuboidal. Cuboidal cells are kind of like dice. That's sort of what they look like most commonly. And then we also have columnar, so it looks like the word column. Columnar cells are like bricks on end or like columns. And then we have squamous, which are like flat floor tiles. So we have 3 different types of epithelial, or 3 different shapes, I guess you would call it, of epithelial cells. Cuboidal, again, like a dice. Columnar, which would be like a column or a stack of bricks. And then squamous, which are like flat floor tiles. In addition to the shape of the epithelial cells, they can be put together in a couple different ways. They can be arranged as a simple single layer. We call that just simple, a single layer. They can be stratified, which means they have multiple tiers or multiple layers of cells, or they can be pseudo-stratified. That would be a single layer of cells of varying length. So if you look at this picture right here, this is epithelial tissue, and you can see the cells here. And I would describe these cells as being columnar or columnar. And then I would also describe them as being pseudo-stratified. It's a single layer of cells, but not every cell is of the exact same length. So yeah, I would probably call this is either going to be simple or pseudo-stratified. It's kind of hard to tell here if they're all the same length or not, but it's definitely simple or pseudo-stratified, and these are columnar or columnar epithelial cells right here that you see. So looking at the epithelial tissue of this wolf, we can look at his external skin, or we can look at the internal coverings of the organs and the digestive system, and you'll see a couple of different shapes. For example, if we look at his external skin, you'd see stratified squamous epithelium, meaning it has multiple layers of flat kind of floor tile shaped cells that would make up his outer skin. If you look at, say, his trachea leading down to his lungs, you might find pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So we have a single layer, columnar or column shaped, but they're not all the same shape and size, you see. Then here we have simple squamous epithelium that's lining the lungs, and again it's a single layer of flattened cells. Simple columnar or columnar epithelium, this is a single layer of all the same shape and size cells, column shape. And then say, for example, in the kidneys back here, you have cuboidal epithelium, and these are more cube or kind of dice shaped cells. So good examples of epithelial tissue, and you describe the epithelial tissue based on the shape of the cell and the way it's arranged. If we're going to be looking at tissue, epithelial tissue, we can also describe it sort of as the inside surface and the outside surface. The outside surface that faces what we call the lumen or the outer surface of the organ is called the apical surface. So this would be the apical surface at the top that you see here. Oftentimes, if you're talking about especially intestines, the apical surface is covered with projections, folds, and bends, like villi in the small intestine is a good example. And then at the lower portion we have the basal surface. That is going to be the portion that does not face the outside environment. The basal surface is going to be connected to what we call the basal lamina. The basal lamina is like the understructure, the foundation, the connective tissue and material that the epithelial cells are connected to. So here you would have epithelial cells connected with connective tissue, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. The outer portion is the apical surface. The inner portion is the basal surface connected to this basal lamina. In this shot, this material down here is called connective tissue. So we have connective tissue, which you have probably heard of before, like collagen. Fat is another form of connective tissue. Connective tissue, you can guess based on its name, its main job is to bind and support other tissues. It contains sparsely packed cells scattered throughout what we call an extracellular matrix, which we've talked about before when we talked about cells themselves. Extracellular matrix is outside of the cells, this material made up of various proteins and fats and lipids and other materials. The matrix consists of fibers and kind of a liquid jelly-like material, or it can be more solid depending on what body part or body system that you're talking about. So there's three types of connective tissue fibers, and actually you've heard of most of these before. I said fat, but that's actually a different kind of tissue we'll look at in just a moment. The connective tissue is collagen. Collagenous fibers provide strength and flexibility. Underneath your skin there is collagen, so when you grab a hold of the back of your hand and pull that skin up and let it go, it kind of snaps back into place, particularly when you're nice and young. That's because of the collagen, kind of an elastic material that your skin is connected to connect it further down to the muscles and bones. We have elastic fibers that stretch and snap back to their original length, and reticular fibers which join connective tissue to adjacent tissue. So connective tissue is made up of collagenous fibers, elastic fibers, and what we call reticular fibers, and these are all just various ways of connecting material together. Connective tissue contains cells, although they're not tightly packed, they're kind of loosely mixed in there. They contain fibroblasts, which secrete the protein of extracellular fibers. So fibroblasts are what make these long filaments of proteins that you see, all these lines and threads, and macrophages that are involved in the immune system. Macrophages are basically similar, or kind of what you might think of as a large white blood cell, similar to that in that they have a function with the immune system. In vertebrate, the fibers and foundation combine to form 6 major types of connective tissue. So if we were to zoom in to, say, the wolf, I think in the book they use what would basically be his knee or his leg, and we were to look at the various connective tissues, we're going to find about 6 different kinds of connective tissue made up of these fibers that we just talked about, the collagenous fibers, elastic and reticular fibers, and basically their job is just to hold everything together. The first thing we have is what we call loose connective tissue. It binds the epithelial to the underlying tissue, holds organs in place. So the reason when you pull up on your skin on the back of your hand that the skin just doesn't come away from the muscle and bone underneath is it's connected by this loose connective tissue with collagen and other material that helps it snap back into place. Then next we have cartilage, which you've probably heard of. Cartilage is strong, flexible support material. Your earlobes are primarily made out of cartilage. The tip of your nose is primarily made out of cartilage. Then we have fibrous connective tissue such as tendons. Tendons attach muscles to bones. If you're going to move your skeleton around, you have to have an attachment point, and tendons are the attachment material that connect muscle and bone. We also have ligaments, which connect bones to bones. So if you look at a skeleton, even if you strip the muscle away, you're still going to have attachment material between bones. So at your knees and elbows and any place where 2 or 3 bones join together at a joint, you're going to have ligaments as well. You have what we call adipose tissue, which is fat material, stores fat for insulation and fuel. And then this sounds a little bit odd, but we also consider blood to be a type of connective tissue. It's composed of blood cells and cell fragments in a liquid called blood plasma. And then bone is actually a type of connective tissue. It's mineralized connective tissue. So bone and cartilage are kind of similar, but cartilage is soft material and bone is mineralized. It has become hard because of the various minerals like calcium and magnesium that are inside of it. So looking at that wolf's knee or his leg here, you can see all these tissues. If you were to look like what connects the skin down below to the muscle and bone, that's going to be these loose connective tissue made up of collagenous and elastic fibers. If you go deeper down, what connects the muscle to the leg bone, that's going to be various fibrous connective tissues. So we have tendons. What connects the bones together? Well, that's going to be ligaments. The bone itself is considered a type of connective tissue. In between the bones, you have kind of a padding made out of cartilage, which is another type of connective tissue. Of course, blood flowing throughout his circulatory system, that is considered a type of connective tissue. And finally, adipose tissue. Adipose tissue would be the fat, or it contains the fat, which is used for insulation, energy storage for the creature. So we've talked about epithelial tissue, connective tissue. The next on the list, the third, is muscle tissue. Muscle tissue consists of long cells called muscle fibers, which are joined together to perform a particular job. So your bicep, if you were to flex and try to show off your biceps, that bicep is a big bundle of many multiple muscle tissue fibers all working together. Contracts in response to nerve signals, so it either contracts or relaxes. Of course, it's connected to your skeletal bones via tendons, and then that allows you to flex your arm, lift things up, move your skeleton around. It's divided into 3 basic types of muscle, which you've studied long ago. Skeletal muscle or striated muscle is responsible for voluntary movement. So when you play basketball, you move your arms and legs around in the proper way. You're primarily using skeletal muscle. You also have what's called smooth muscle. It's called smooth because under a microscope it lacks the lines or the striations of the skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle is responsible for involuntary body activities. When your stomach starts to rumble, or the muscles that push your blood through your arteries and veins, those are all smooth muscles. You don't really have to think about them. They work on their own. And then cardiac muscle is kind of a combination of the two. It's strong like the skeletal muscle, but it acts involuntarily like the smooth, and it's responsible for the contraction of the heart. So again, going back to our little wolf buddy, if we look at all the muscles that make up his hind leg, that's going to be skeletal muscle. Notice the little lines or striations, which is why it's called striated muscle. If we go into his intestines, we might see that there is smooth muscle. It lacks the striations of the skeletal muscle, so his food is being pushed through his digestive system without him consciously thinking about it. And then a heart is made up of cardiac muscle. Actually looks like a combination of the two of these, and it is involuntary, but it has some striations, so it's a special third kind of muscle only found there in the heart. Our last basic tissue type to look at is called nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is what your senses are all about. It senses stimuli, transmits signals throughout the animal. So when you hear or see or smell, that signal is being sent with nervous tissue. You have what you call neurons, which are the actual nerve cells that transmit nerve impulses. And then we have glial cells, or glia, which are basically all the cells surrounding the neurons that help nourish them and insulate them, replenish the neurons, kind of like the support team for the neurons themselves. If we were to go back to our wolf buddy one more time, we could look at his brain and his spinal cord running down from his brain. Within there you're going to find neurons, which are very oddly shaped cells. They certainly don't look like skin cells or bone cells because they have a particular job. They're basically an electrical wiring system. The nervous system works off of both electrical signals and chemical signals, which we'll talk a little bit more in detail later. But this neuron tends to be very long, tree-shaped with lots of different branches off of it. So that is the nerve cell itself. Surrounding those nerve cells are glia, or glial cells, and they kind of form the support network, provide nutrition and other materials needed for the advanced nervous system to work properly. Here's a nice shot of a single neuron with all its various parts, and then the glia that you see represented here in blue. The red is the blood vessels, and the yellow is the parts, axons of the neurons, kind of the tail ends of the neurons. For a complex creature like a wolf or a human being to react to its environment, it takes a lot of coordination. I mean, you've got a lot of complex body parts. They all have to work together if you want to accomplish the goal of chasing down your prey or escaping from your enemy. So coordination and control is very important. And the body system depends really on two systems working together to do that. It depends on the endocrine system and the nervous system. So for example, a seal diving deep down into the ocean to go after its prey. There's a lot of environmental changes that are going to take place as that seal dives deeper and deeper. That's going to affect numerous body systems. So everything has to be coordinated together for that seal to accomplish his goal and to get back up to the surface and breathe and survive. So that seal diving for his prey, his body has to work in concert. All these systems and parts have to coordinate their activities to survive and accomplish the task. The endocrine system transmits chemical signals called hormones. We already talked about the nervous system primarily uses electrical signals and also a chemical signal that jumps from one neuron to the next. But the endocrine system works off of chemicals, and these chemicals are called hormones, and they are sent throughout the entire body, and cells that recognize this signal then react. So the hormones are sent through the blood system, the circulatory system, and they're spread throughout the entire body. Lots of the body parts, lots of the body cells will get this signal but just ignore it because it doesn't affect them. It would be like if someone sends a flyer for mowing lawns throughout the entire neighborhood, but half the people in the neighborhood don't have a lawn. They just have concrete out front. Well, the guy might send flyers to everyone in the neighborhood, but it doesn't apply to those people that don't have a lawn, so they're just going to ignore the flyer. So a hormone is a chemical messenger sent throughout the body. A hormone can affect one or more regions throughout the body, and the hormone can usually be not as fast acting as a neuron or a nerve signal. It's usually relatively slow acting, but it tends to last longer. So hormones are best for gradual changes such as growth and development, reproduction, digestion. For example, when animals or humans go through puberty, most of those changes are affected by hormones. It's a slower, more longer lasting sort of signal, and so it's best for gradual change. So here you have an example of the two. If you're talking about signaling by hormones, you have particular cells called endocrine or endocrine cells that give off these chemicals, which are then spread throughout the entire body by the circulatory system. Some cells respond to this chemical signal and some do not. The ones that have the right receptors will then give a response. Compare that to a neuron or a nerve signal where you have a particular stimulus that causes a nerve signal to send an electrical signal. this signal is going to go to a specific location. It's not going to travel throughout the entire body. It's a specific message. This would be like mail coming to your house. It is addressed to your house. It's not going to go to everyone in the neighborhood. It's simply going to go straight to your house. And so this is very fast and very specific, and it's going to provoke or provide a response in a specific cell or specific area of the body. So again, comparing the two, signaling by hormones is more diffuse throughout the entire body using chemicals. Signaling by neurons is primarily using electrical signals, nerve impulses, to a very specific place. So the nervous system transmits information between specific locations, and most of that is conveyed on a single pathway. It depends, the type of information depends on the signal's pathway. Nerve signal transmission is very fast, electricity moves very fast, and nerve impulses can be received by neurons, muscle cells, endocrine cells, and exocrine cells. So nerve impulses can go to different parts of the body, but they have a specific place that they are sending the message to. Nerve signals are best for fast-acting, short-term changes such as movement, locomotion, behavioral response, fight or flight, that type of thing is best taken care of by the nervous system. So again, on the back end, you have very diffuse signaling done by chemicals, hormones in the endocrine system, and you have very specific targeted nerve impulses going to provoke a particular response in a particular body part when you're talking about neurons. Both of these systems are very important for coordination and communication between the body parts, and oftentimes they work together. So if you think about the fight or flight response, if someone were to jump out of a dark corner and scare you, there's going to be a combination of nerve signals and hormones released at the same time. Your nervous system and neurons may give you instant information and provide for instant action, and the hormones like adrenaline may kind of amp you up and get you ready to fight or run. But you might notice that, let's say it's your little brother who jumps out from behind a door. After you see it's your little brother, your nervous system calms back down and says, okay, well, it's nothing. But your heart may continue to beat and race for a couple of minutes, and that tight feeling in your stomach may continue for a couple of minutes even after you know that you're safe and it's just your little brother. That's because the hormones, the chemicals, stick around for a while, and that doesn't go away instantly like the nervous signal goes away. So let's stop right there, talking about coordination and control. Next, we're going to go talk about how animals maintain a steady internal environment when the outside environment can change quite drastically. That's all about homeostasis. That'll be concept 40.2. Let's take a break. We'll come right back.